Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's episode of Ramblemancy. Just making sure that my thing. Okay, cool. We're good. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome to the area. The area being tonight's episode. Um, you will perhaps notice that we are without Henry, but that's okay because tonight we have one Mr. Jonathan Boyle. Welcome,
That's
John.
me. Hey,
Um,
it's nice to be here.
yeah. So,
I'm I'm usually either a disembodied voiceover stream or just not on streams.
right, yeah. It's a Spigs. Hello,
Oh,
welcome.
Spigs.
Hey,
Oh my God,
Oh,
Nico subbed at tier one. Welcome. What
it's a
is up
10-year
yourself?
streak.
So, hey, so I think, I'm not sure, I'll have to double check, but I think that one subscription, we were you didn't even let me get there, Nico, but I was going to announce that we are one sub point away from our next emote slot, uh, which I'm not sure if that got us there, but it might have, so, um, we will see. Um, we have on that subject we have been working on getting a new emote because we've had an emote slot for a long time that we just haven't done anything with, and now we're working on that, but we are also working on a second emote, new emote, in anticipation of perhaps tonight. So yeah, we'll be seeing some new emotes very soon. Um, I'm very excited. It's
Having insider knowledge of what they are, I'm be very excited.
I think we've mentioned already that there is, in fact, I think we've already talked about the fact that there is going to be a Bina grabby hands emote. So,
yep,
um,
absolutely.
so
I'm so excited for that one.
yes, so that one is coming, as well as another one that will remain mysterious. Um, so yeah.
Perfect.
Um, all right. I think we can just start. So, tonight we're talking about relative power levels and in fiction and games. And since Henry's not here, John, I'm going to throw you under the bus. What do you got for us?
Relative power levels in games is a concept that's been in the zeitgeist of discussion for some time since.
Sorry,
All
I'm
right,
not.
Freeman,
I'm
what you
not
got? No.
nearly.
Oh
I'm not
no.
nearly as good as
Oh,
as good at doing that as Henry is. Not nearly as practiced, shall we say?
Right.
But like, interestingly enough, I think one of the first things that is kind of in the current media zeitgeist that came to mind when we were talking about this topic earlier this week is kind of the difference in power levels in like Avatar: The Last Airbender,
Oh man, where's Amethyst
in
Cat Lady when you need
particular.
her?
Yeah, I know. Um, but no, like I think there's a lot of like robust storytelling potential when you start examining the differences in power level between characters, and then like even the types of power that they have, and kind of like stacking those up next to each other. So it's because to me at least, Azula in Avatar: The Last Airbender is kind of repeatedly held up as this figure that is much more powerful than like any single member of the Avatar gang combined. And then it sort of things play out. How do we feel about spoilers on Ramblemancy?
So here's the thing. Our typical spoiler policy on most things is like a week later. I think we're past that with Avatar The Last Airbender, by like a small margin.
Just a little
So,
bit.
yeah.
um, but yeah. So I think we're good here.
Okay, cool. But like when it comes to the very end of the series, like Azula, who's been built up as this villain of tremendous like technical skill and like this prodigy at firebending, is defeated by her brother, who is again like repeatedly throughout the series been kind of like held up as at least from the clues that we are given as the audience is kind of held up as um, less powerful, perhaps, in some ways, or a less skilled firebender.
Yeah. Um, hold on a second. Hold that thought, because I have several thoughts. First of all, I want
Mhm.
I
to
do
address.
too, actually.
I want to address chat real quick because I saw Spigs asking this question. Are you guys doing anything for Gen Con? I don't know yet. We haven't talked about it, but it has certainly been on my mind. We will see is the answer to that question. Also, hello, jolly old Obnixilis, welcome. And
Hey.
Amethyst Cat Lady, we were just talking about you. I'm wondering where you were, because we're starting off tonight talking about Avatar. So, and then my other comment, John, to you is that
Mhm.
while he is, this is my actually moment. Um,
I
but
think I know what it is too.
while Zuko is present when Azula is defeated, technically it was Katara who defeated Azula.
Yeah.
That's true. Actually, you are correct that it was not Zuko who did it.
Hmm.
But Zuko like held at least in the last Agni Kai, much of the stunningly beautiful
Hmm.
like visuals in that scene are of those two siblings fighting, and he holds his own pretty well. So totally
And here's
dunked Azula,
Literally.
literally and figuratively.
Yeah, and it was the most beautiful thing. And the thing about Zuko is you have to remember that ever since he was banished, and even before that, he's always been knocked down, and he's always gotten himself back up and like got back on the horse, as they say. He's always had to fight for that, and so at the end, it's just it really all comes together. How that's actually really showed in his character over time. It's
Yeah.
really built his strength
So
inside.
so I'm glad you brought that, because I do want, let's talk about that, because we're talking when we first brought up this subject as a possibility for the conversation on Ramblemancy. Um, we were talking about this specific moment in Avatar: The Last Airbender. This is like the first thing that came up, and we are talking about relative power levels. And so here's what I'm going to say about this is that John and Freeman, both of you have kind of like brought us right to the brink of the core issue here, which is that
Mhm.
John, you brought up Azula's like her technical prowess at firebending and her just sort of
Right.
that raw power that she has behind it. And Freeman, you brought up the Zuko's character and his ability to just keep getting back up, right? And I think uh, that brings us kind of to that moment in the last Agni Kai, right, where Zuko holds his own, not like he, I guess they win the day, I guess, not because of like Zuko suddenly becoming just this masterful, powerful, like firebender who could. Y'all are getting ready to test me here tonight. Thank
Oh
you
goodness
so
me.
much for the anonymous gift subs. Thank you. Um,
Lovely.
forgot what I was saying. Anyway, but oh, that the whole thing at the end comes from, like, we're talking source of power and relative. This is why relative power levels, because it's power. Like,
Hmm.
there is no question that Azula is a more powerful firebender than Zuko is.
Mhm.
Like, there's just no question of that. The whole series spends
Spend
time.
you spend seasons
Yeah.
like establishing the fact that that Azula is of the two of them the more powerful
Mm-hmm.
firebender.
Yeah, and that's like even that whole sequence with Iroh trying to teach Zuko to shoot lightning, and then eventually going like, you know what? I'm actually going to teach you how to redirect it instead. Um, cause, and I think that's important, because, and this is why we this exact conversation is why we ultimately chose to have this conversation tonight, is because relative power means that it's not just like power in terms of like, I'm a Super Saiyan. Well, I'm a Super Saiyan too. Well, like, right, like it's
Mhm.
Hmm.
that's not really what we were going for here, but more the yeah, exactly, Amethyst Cat Lady. The important to note the symbolism of Zuko redirecting, uh, yeah, redirecting lightning. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and then directed it toward him, not allowing it to harm him. Exactly. Yes. Okay. So that's what like. So we're not talking necessarily about Zuko defeating Azula because technically it was absolutely Katara who did it, like pretty much. But we're talking about mostly like why Azula was defeated in the end, and this is where we come into the whole idea of relative power levels, because Zuko's power comes in a totally different form than Azula's, and I think that's kind of the heart of this, right? Like this is not going to be purely the I promise this is not going to be purely the Avatar: The Last Airbender thing, Ramblemancy, because we could have a whole other Ramblemancy on just that alone. So, and we will probably. Now that it is once again in prominent in the zeitgeist and more people are watching it, so.
Mm-hmm. I have a point, or do you want to address chat?
Mm-hmm. Sure, go for it.
Just to like kind of piggyback off of that idea too. Like I think, and this is kind of also off of what Amethyst Cat Lady was talking about, like the idea, like the thematic content of teaching Zuko to redirect lightning, to redirect hurt, right? Is, I think, like sort of a poignant, especially given the context of the last Agni Kai, is a super like potent storytelling like note to focus on too, because Zuko was able to like find, because firebenders in particular are very much like fueled by or driven by emotion, more so perhaps than any of the benders of the other elements. And the way like the way in which that he learned to not just like to cope with his own pain and like move past that and be vulnerable with other people, whereas like Azula was, and where Azula was like still holding that all in and trying to like force the relationships that Zuko, through his own like through introspection and painful personal growth, had managed to build around himself, was trying to force those relationships through like ways that were self-destructive. And it kind of harkens back to Iroh, like not, if I remember correctly, like one of the reasons that Iroh like chose not to tell or not to teach Zuko how to shoot lightning is because it could be so dangerous to oneself to do it. Right, holding that much.
Yeah, and Amethyst Cat Lady also brings up another point, which is that, and Geek Outs together bring up the point that like Azula learned more advanced techniques, and whereas Zuko became proficient with the basics, which is what his uncle was emphasizing, right? And that I think is also an important point, because that was something when I was a kid. I took Taekwondo for several years, and I became like very like sort of single-minded in my dedication to like learning more advanced forms and advanced techniques and things like that. But I I always so then we'd have these tournaments, right, that we would go to and compete in, and there was like the sparring tournament, there's the forms tournament, there was another thing and I don't remember what it was, but there was like three main things in that tournament. And my first time at the tournament, I won in my age group. I won the gold for forms, but I never did it again, and I never got close again in the forms category, and the reason I suspect is because at the time the first tournament I went to, I only knew the basics, and that's what I was focusing on. Later on, I got so much more focused on the like more advanced forms and all of that sort of stuff, and so I like was learning a lot more stuff, but I wasn't perfecting any of it. And so like I think that's an important point that Amethyst and Geek Outs both brought up, that yeah, you got to learn like the first Agni Kai that Zuko is in the show. Like Iroh is talking about like that whole episode when he's with like fighting Zhao, right?
Mm-hmm.
That whole like the beginning of the episode is them practicing and Zuko being like, "This is not what I need. I need to learn more advanced stuff. This is the like the basic stuff." And in the end, he beats Zhao by using the basic stuff. When he goes, "Break his roots," right? Like that is, yeah.
And that's an interesting question that like brings me around to Iroh, who is like again he's like the one of the many kind of wise old mentor like figures in that series, and I think like an almost archetypal figure in modern fiction at this point of a wise old mentor, with the nice twist in this particular hero's journey being that the wise old mentor doesn't necessarily have to die
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
in order for the hero's journey to like continue or complete. But there's something to be said too, thematically about the the technique, like the basic techniques that Iroh is teaching him are grounded in not just firebending,
Mm-hmm.
whereas Zula is a peak firebender, and that is that is what Azula is insanely good at. She's, you know, to I was thinking as you were just describing that, Lucas, like a mile wide and an inch deep, and Azula's like an inch wide and a mile deep on firebending. Whereas like in the last Agni Kai, there's several moments like lightning redirection itself is a technique derived from waterbenders, and there's several moves that he uses that are very reminiscent of the way that Aang redirects firebending with airbending.
Mm-hmm.
And then like with Zhao like breaking his root, I can't remember, but I want to say that that Iroh alludes to earthbenders using the same technique.
I don't know that he does there, but I know he does at some point in the series, talking about having, like, learning a technique by studying, learning something by studying the Earthbenders. But I don't know if it was that. But I know
Okay.
that it happens
Right,
at
which
some point.
like that point brings me kind of to the conclusion of that of this idea, which is that like Zuko's strength comes not just from firebending, but also from like the found family, or like the elements of community that he opens himself up to, as opposed to
Well,
just like raw firebending
and
technique.
this now kind of pivoting a little bit. This takes us to a conversation, a point that I was trying to make a couple weeks ago that I was not particularly successful in doing. But this brings us kind of to the, because the other thing, I think the other source of Zuko's power and Aang's, really everybody in that show, like, the more I think about it, the more I'm like, oh yeah, this is like kind of the key thing, is uh wisdom. And I don't necessarily mean wisdom in the sense like where it's almost synonymous with knowledge. I mean wisdom in the sense that, like, at some point every single one of them has, like, borrows from another technique, not necessarily another kingdom, like another bending technique, but they borrow knowledge. They borrow, and in this case it's the wisdom of knowing that the way that I know is not always the best way, is not the only way. And that brings us to the conversation that I was going to have, that I was trying to bring up the other day, a couple Ramblemancies ago or something, about the Jedi and Sith,
Mm.
right? About how, like, the Sith believe that the only, like, if you put limitations on your powers, such as, like controlling emotions and that kind of thing, then obviously that makes you weaker. And the Jedi believe that you are more unfocused, uncontrollable, and just wild, and more likely to make mistakes, and to, tilt to the dark side if you do the whole, like, if you don't control your emotions. And it's an interesting point where this is the case where both of them are so antagonistic to the other's methods that each fails to see the merit in either, right? Like, in the other.
Hmm.
And I think that's a really key thing, uh in uh when we're talking about power. It's important to, I think, examine where various people think it comes from, right? And how they think it is attained. And I think that's a big one.
Yeah, in that, like, it seems like a lot of, and especially villainous characters, seem to believe that absolute power comes from, like, the most perfect form of something. And then oftentimes, because this is a theme that shows up naturally, I think, in a lot of, especially fantasy, but in a lot of fiction, is that, like, um, power comes from community and imperfection and like and our flaws, right? So it comes power comes from more than one place and more than just you, right?
Hmm. And I think Geek Outs is bringing out a really excellent point here as well that's related, very much related to this, which is, but also this topic is fluid because how do you define power? Like, what is powerful? Exactly. That's my point. That is exactly the point that I'm making. Because, and it's using the example of Jedi and Sith again, is the Sith look at what the Jedi are doing and going, oh, that, that's not power the way that we understand what power is, so that therefore it must be weakness, right?
Mm-hmm.
When in reality, that's just not the case, right? Like there, like in that universe, there's power to be found in both sides, right? Like they're in either side. We're not talking about philosophies here. We're not talking. I'm not doing the whole both sidism for Jedi and Sith
Right.
because clearly
Mhm.
there is one that is objectively more terrible than the other. We're not talking about philosophies. We're talking
Mhm.
strictly like in terms of where they see the source of their power.
Well, and it's an interesting turn of phrase that you use there versus power versus weakness, and I don't think that those are the direct comparisons there. There's strength and weakness, and those are opposites, right?
Maybe
But
there's
and
there's arguments there, but yes,
yeah,
continue.
there's a there's a oh god, there's a I can't even think of the word that I want. You're correct though.
Hmm.
But like strength and weakness are closer to opposites than power and weakness are, because I think, as Derpenduin so aptly put in the chat, power is being able to choose, right? And so we talked about Ozai, and like a display of strength in the way that Kyoshi would have pushed for would have been to defeat and then like to defeat Ozai by killing him, whereas Aang, I think, displays or like displays the choice that perhaps either requires or manifests greater power, which is to alter the course or like almost break the cycle of violence that has been set in motion by the 100 Years' War.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think
And
this
he
is.
pulls from some really old magics too.
Yeah.
That is some that just like I love that so much. And you don't even know about that until you
Yeah,
reach the next
yeah, and I think
Legend of Korra.
Geek Outs has it right. Basically, this is what I was trying to say: is that willpower is a form of strength, and restraint is another. And I think that's important because, like, one of the things that always struck me about like Sith ideology and the way that they deride the Jedi and the Jedi doctrine and their techniques is that they, I mean, the idea of taking the time to train yourself to be able to control your emotional responses, to control your anger and your fear and all that sort of stuff. Um, think like think about the kind of strength that requires, the strength of will and the strength of character that requires, right? To
Mm-hmm.
not just when you're feeling something just unleash it, right? To like keep a hold on it, control it, and not let it control you, right? Like that is a big deal. That's one of the things that I've always looked at as the strength, or the Sith just like didn't fucking get about the Jedi, and they just don't seem to understand that that is the case. And they look at it as putting limitations on oneself and like and essentially like hobbling one's own power basically. But yeah, like I don't know.
There's a line in William Blake's poetry somewhere where he talks about like suppressing or controlling one's genius or like desires, and what he's referring to really is like creative energy. But it strikes me as the way that it's written strikes me as like very Sith almost,
Mm-hmm.
in the way that he's like, if you can control them, then it's then your emotions are weak, or then your power is weak, or whatever, something like
Mm-hmm.
that. It strikes me as a very Sith feeling,
Yeah.
right? If you can control them, then you aren't powerful at all. Whereas like that power of self-regulation um, is considerable,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah. There are few things that are harder to control than the self.
No kidding. Therapists everywhere nodding in assent.
Yeah. But yeah, like that's I think that's an important thing to look at cuz and like I think it was Geek Outs that brought it up, which is the how do you even define it? And that's just it. uh, anybody can pick a point and say this is what power is, and then like start building their walls around that and saying, all right, this is this thing, and anything that isn't this is the opposite of this.
Mm-hmm.
you know, um, and that's exactly the point. That right there, Geek Outs, is exactly why we decided that this was going to be the topic for tonight's Ramblemancy, is because there really isn't a single definition of it, and that's why we went with relative power levels, because there's so many different ways of defining it.
Mm-hmm. And there's lots of rich conversation to have about what constitutes power and what makes one character more powerful in one situation than another. And I mean, of course, there's plenty of content out there for people to be like, Batman versus Superman, who would win? Let's take this one by the numbers, boys.
Right. Yeah. I know that there's somebody who is actually, like, at least a while back, that I don't remember if I read it or not, but somebody actually found a way of comparing who between Goku and Superman would be stronger.
Huh.
Yeah.
I just like also in terms of measuring power levels, I still think it cannot get more iconic than that one like moment in like bad dubbing history in Dragon Ball Z. And I think we all know that. I think we all know the one to which I am referring. It's over 9,000. Well, that's how we measure power level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Through a arbitrary scale that somehow everybody seems to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amethyst Cat Lady is talking about a. Hold on. Where to go? The anime manga Fruit Basket. That early on in the series, one character tells the other that if he were to punch the table in front of them, he's confident he could break it in half. However, he was equally confident that he had the training to be able to swing his arm down and stop before he hit the table, or slash hit the table without breaking it. Varies based on translation. Both skills require extensive training and restraint. Yes, exactly. That is exactly what we're talking about, and kind of the point that I was trying to bring up with Jedi and Sith. I think it's very interesting because, and it's also I think it's also worth noting, at least with the Jedi and Sith analogy, that uh, both sides of that have two very different conversations. Because the Jedi aren't going over here going like, oh, what's the best way to become the most powerful Jedi? Like, that's not the conversation they're having, right? That is the conversation that the Sith are having, right? So it's important to note that that their goals are completely different. Like their end goal for studying and mastering the Force are totally different. Um, yeah, because like
Secrets.
Hmm?
Oh, sorry. Just no. Finish. I just saw something. I was just repeating something that Geek got said in chat because I was like, ooh, yes.
Yeah. Well, I was just gonna say a thing going off the Jedi Sith thing, but I think it's more widely applicable. Yes, Amethyst Cat Lady, discipline. That is the word. Um, um, but it's the idea that oh shit, I lost it. It's gone. I'll probably come back to it. It'll come back to me eventually. Nico says, I recently rewatched one of my favorite story arcs of anime history, Hidan and Kazuku versus Team 10 and Team 7 from Naruto. Having that in my mind, I must say that matchup is a big part of the power level conversation. Okay, what do you mean by that? I'm curious what you mean.
Yeah.
Because that seems like an interesting direction to take this. So I'm curious what you mean by that. I'm trying to think of.
As in, like, which character versus which character, or like the circumstances, or
Yeah. Is this? Yeah, I'm curious as to the answer to that question, because, but while I'm waiting, I will also say that while at first I was not sure whether or not Nico's resub counted. I am absolutely certain that the gift sub does count. So we have reached,
Ooh,
we have unlocked our next emote slot. So
Woo.
we're getting two, y'all. We're getting two soon.
I love it.
Be excited.
Hmm.
I have seen drafts of both of them, and being a
Mhm.
grabby hands is excellent.
Yes, I'm very excited for that one. Um, let's see. Okay, so oh yes, Freeman.
Uh, it's one of those moments where I was like, "Yeah, I've got something to say," and I was like, "Oh wait, no, it it
Oh,
left.
it's gone.
It left. It'll come back, you know."
Oh, karaoke night 69.
Ooh.
Tentacles.
List of things that are related to power: wealth, influence, knowledge, wisdom, secrets, physical prowess, and many others.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Nico says, uh, Asuma Surutobi was arguably a much stronger fighter than Hidan, but Hidan's particular ability to inflict all damage he takes back to who he cursed made the fight impossible to win. Okay. So, uh, are you saying that it comes to the conversation is one that about that power is sort of gauging relative power is dependent on who is facing whom? Is that kind of what you're saying?
I think a little bit, and then I think also like there's a conversation. I think also just like talking about the nature of the character's power that's at play.
Mm.
Like in this,
Mm-hmm.
in the example that we've got here, we have a character who like probably, again, I haven't seen it, but like is like physically stronger or like magically stronger than the other character, but you have another character whose own power is like is reflection.
Okay, so kind of like the idea in that I have in Marvel, where that like, or rather, how I think the Defenders should have gone but didn't, is you've got Jessica Jones and Luke Cage, who are like the heavy hitters, the blunt instruments, basically, who like go in and just wreck shit. And then you've got your precision instruments, like your technical fighters, like the Iron Fist and Daredevil. And they're the ones who are like technically more masterful at fighting. But you don't want to get hit by Jessica Jones or Luke Cage because it's like being hit by like three trucks simultaneously.
Mhm.
So,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, okay. I think I see. I think is that kind of where you're coming from, Nico? Because
He
yeah.
says, I think he says, yeah, basically.
Oh, okay. I missed that. Yeah. Cool. Um. Yeah, I could see that, but I also think I think it's a conversation worth having, especially if you're talking about um, if you're trying to determine uh, if you're trying to determine like who between two specific individuals is more powerful. That is a very important question to ask, for sure. Um, I but that I think is a different conversation than the one that I think we were having before, which is kind of more in the line of like what is power, what is powerful.
Mm-hmm.
I think those, and I think they're not unrelated, but one of them is a very sort of macro question, grand scale, like what is the nature of existence, right? And the other one is what did you have for breakfast this morning, right? Like
I,
not unimportant because as we know, breakfast is the most important meal of the day, but a different conversation for a different case, and I think that is.
Hmm.
I'm glad you brought it up because that's an important distinction to make, I think. Relative power in terms of comparing two power levels, and then relative power in terms of comparing different types of power, right? I think is that kind of the dichotomy I'm seeing here? That's kind of what I'm seeing. I don't know. Maybe
mm.
I'm speaking nonsense. I don't know what's happening.
I think Geekouts has also made an excellent point in chat, which is that second breakfast is the most important meal of the day. You think he knows about second breakfast? No, Pip.
I don't believe you do.
So,
I need to watch
but this
that.
is but that's I mean Lord of the Rings is another great example, right?
Mhm.
Power, right? You've got the objective power of the ring and the magic that Sauron pours into it and all that. And then you've got Frodo's ability to resist it, right? To resist
Yeah.
the overwhelming power and temptation. And in so many ways that is a conversation that dominates so much of Western media, at
mhm.
least Western media. I say that because that's what I'm the most familiar with. But like that is a yeah, exactly. Geekouts. Hobbits prove that bravery is power. Exactly.
And one of the notes that I made for myself when I was thinking about things to talk about tonight was power structures in terms of relative power
Mm-hmm.
levels. And I think that one of the
Hmm.
things that affords hobbits the power that they have is their kind of separation from the power structures of Middle Earth. Right? There's all the machinations of there's the machinations of men, and then there's the machinations of like the various like fallen angels that constitute like Sauron and all of the bad guys in the series. And hobbits are kind of like outside of all of this, and so in a way that elves and dwarves and men cannot resist the like the alluring power of the ring. there's um there's something to be said for the fact that the hobbits are not part of any of these existing structures, and so like they're almost able to circumvent them
Yeah.
without
Well, and
holding
that's
the same type or level of power of the other ones. And in fact, go ahead.
no. Go ahead. Go ahead. Finish up. Because yeah.
I was going to say their power is almost that they don't have the same kind of power that
Yeah.
the rest of Middle Earth has.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I was going to say. That brings us back to the question that Nico was pointing us to, right? The idea of like looking at this from the perspective of writing, for example. If you are writing these stories, it's important to ask who has more, like which party has more power, and how do those powers match up against each other. And
Mhm.
then furthermore, and this is where the link comes in, what type of power is it? What type of power does each party have? And that's where I think the question that Nico was bringing us to is so important. It's because I think on the perspective of the consumer, on the consumer of media and stories, it's kind of it's too easy to with for that question to stray into the context of um like, oh, who would win in a fight, right? But
Mhm.
which can be fun, but ultimately there's not a whole lot of there's not a whole lot that's worthwhile. Where that question I think really shines is in the creation of media, when you have to ask yourself, because then you have to ask yourself who has what kind of power and who has more relative power. And I think that's what matters, because that's what kind of goes into what is the theme of what I am creating? What message am I trying to get across with this? And I think that's such an important question there.
Yeah, because and again, like it's almost kind of necessary for it's necessary as a storyteller, I think, for there to be an imbalance of power. Like the relative power level of a story is important to consider, because if everybody has about the same amount of power, then there's not a lot that's interesting that's happening in this universe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the reason that stories happen is because oftentimes someone has more power than someone else and is abusing it,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And again, like there's the character versus character question to be had of like how long could character resist the ring? Like if you're going to hold up, certainly like Aragorn can perhaps hold off the allure of the ring longer than Boromir could if either of them were to use it.
Mm-hmm.
But that question doesn't super matter because the result is still the same.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so the necessary thing to happen in that story is for that structure of power, that cycle, to be circumvented in some way, a new kind of power to be introduced into that like series of them.
Yeah. Um, before I, because I want to get Freeman's input, but before I go, I will
Hmm.
say that Amethyst Cat Lady earlier said, um, hold on, strength in anime equals friendship. Yes, strength in anime, and rule of lore programming. Um, um,
True.
but yeah, so Freeman,
Yeah.
I want to hear some of your thoughts on this idea of power and relative power. What do you got?
Well, in terms of, I like the Lord of the Rings, using Lord of the Rings
Mhm.
as a talking to draw examples from, because we're all very familiar with the Lord of the Rings. Um, there's a certain amount. The power comes from the hobbits, I believe. There's a certain amount of. I don't know if this was already mentioned in just in different words, but like a certain amount of. They're not corrupt.
Mhm.
There's a level of non-corruption in their world, because they live in a very outside of the world's problem area, and they hear stories, but they're more to themselves. So not having that mindset kind of helps too, I think. I don't know if that real
No,
yeah, that's kind of how I feel though.
you're right.
um
That's what I was thinking too. Actually, when John was talking, that's exactly what I was thinking. Because like
yeah.
the hobbits, like just and we can. That's a sort of a different conversation to talk about the problematic aspects of certain races having certain uh, levels of uh, corruptibility or incorruptibility, and we won't go
Right.
there right now because that's not what we're talking about.
Right.
Uh, but I think that is kind of the thing that I was thinking about when what you just said, Freeman, is that hobbits sort of are less corruptible in part because they there's a certain level of like of humility to their aspirations, right? Like their aspirations
Yeah.
are ones like you don't ever see hobbits being like, "Oh, I'm going to rule the Shire," right? Like you don't. That's not a thing that they even enters their mind. They're just like,
They're thinking about what's going to be for third breakfast,
Hmm.
yeah,
and they
they're
haven't
like
finished first yet.
their whole thing is basically just about like, I just want to live a nice, comfortable
Yeah.
life, and I kind of wish that everybody else could too, you know.
Mhm.
And that's basically like like uh their ambitions are they begin and end with, are my pumpkins bigger than my neighbor's pumpkins? Doesn't matter because they're all going to be pie later. Right? Like that's yeah. I think that is a good point, Freeman. That and
And
yeah.
to that end, to kind of bring this particular part of this discussion about power structures around, like, there's a lot of vying for power that occurs in many of the other places in Middle Earth, but kind of as you put it, like, there's never any mention of people jockeying for power in any any of the halfling, or sorry, hobbit shire like areas, you
Yeah.
know.
I mean there are certainly the ambitious hobbits like, but it's more for like for social standing than any actual kind of power,
Mhm.
right? Like the
Hmm.
Sackville Baggins is. What like
Yeah.
in the books you see about them trying to like one up Bilbo and Bilbo's family and all that sort of stuff because they've never gotten over being, you know, like slighted somewhere back in their line or whatever. And but that's more about like their social ambitions. You never what you never hear is about them having jockeying for political power or other types of power. It's mostly just about social, which calls back to their whole, you know, the humble nature of their aspirations. Even their most ambitious aspirations are on a social communal level, right?
Mhm.
Hmm.
So I don't know. Yeah.
I think, and this is again Ramblemancy. This isn't directly, I think, linked to the conversation, but there is something to be said, I think, about the way that the Hobbit society and the way that their ambitions are framed. There's something there. Or it's worth noting that J.R.R. Tolkien spent like his whole childhood just wandering around the countryside, like doing just like wandering around and being outside and stuff. So like I think it's telling that that was the like that was the society of people that seemed like very deeply connected with his own childhood.
Mm-hmm.
That came to be the element that changed the course of Middle Earth's history.
Yeah. Um, I will also say, I think Amethyst Cat Lady raises an excellent point here, which is to say that fuck turfs and all cops are bastards.
Excellent point.
Indeed.
An excellent point. Yes. Um. Oh,
Oh wow.
I know it's
We all
weird.
get-
My whole
Usually
episode-
that happens to me.
I know
yeah.
it's usually John that's out of focus.
I finally managed to download something so that I can manually adjust my camera focus,
Yeah.
so it is
Oh, nice.
permanently focused on this.
Yes. There you go. you might have to let me know what that is because there's one of our cameras that we like straight up don't use because
Yeah.
It just won't.
it just won't. It chooses not to for whatever reason. So, yep. And this says John is voguing and I'm here for it. Hmm.
This is the premium rule of lore content that you come here
Yeah.
is John striking runway poses on
Yeah.
camera for 10
John
minutes.
vogues at the camera, and meanwhile my hair is doing whatever the hell it decided this was. So, you know.
Listen, I have freshly combed nap bedheads, so like
Perfect.
fine.
Yeah. And meanwhile, Freeman's hair is behaving perfectly fine.
In a sense, I was it wasn't
It's
cooperating,
too powerful.
so I had to cut it all off because it was kind of just falling out in the front here. So I thought, well, I'll see if I can shave it off and just do this thing for a minute or two.
Excellent. Yep. Well, the
It's
results
refreshing.
speak for themselves. Um, oh gosh, I know there was another place I was gonna go, and I don't remember where it is now. So I'm just gonna stare awkwardly at the camera until somebody says something.
Yeah, no, it was we were discussing Tolkien and the life spent in the countryside and hobbits and their social aspirations. If that's stirring anything.
It really isn't.
All
I don't
right,
think it was
fair.
related to that. I think it was a total subject change, but which, in fairness, we got one of those, but it was not on my terms. So,
Yeah, for sure. We've talked a lot about fiction at this point. Do we want to turn the conversation, since we're coming up on, I almost said 10 o'clock, it's 8 o'clock for you guys.
I was gonna say,
Right.
whoa.
Since we're coming up on 8.
wow, extra long episode of Ramblemancy.
yeah.
It's a 4-hour Ramblemancy. Or 3 hour, whatever. I don't. When do we start this show?
Right?
What time do we start the show?
Marathon Mancy.
I don't know. Anyway, yes.
Do we want to turn the conversation towards RPGs a little bit?
Yeah.
I was gonna go there eventually. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a
I
good
was
idea.
definitely gonna do that.
So
I'm not.
I think
Yeah.
I started watching Dimension 20's Fantasy High
Mm-hmm.
this week, and I've been ranting about it on and off to friends. But of course, they start, as many adventuring parties do in Dungeons and Dragons, at level 1.
Mm-hmm.
And as somebody who's been playing a 6th tier Cipher character, which is the highest tier you can be in that game, and who's played an 18th level D&D character recently, which is the highest, like close to the highest level beyond homebrew or outside of homebrew that you can be in Dungeons and Dragons. Those are all very extremely powerful characters, and so like watching them fight essentially like a gelatinous cube and some baby, like little baby ooze things at the very beginning, and half of the party wiping to it because they all have like 10 health is wild to me. And so there's
No,
do you
continue.
have a thought? Okay, I was just going to say there's definitely a very different feel to what feels dangerous at the beginning of an RPG or,
Yeah.
or a tabletop RPG than as opposed to what feels dangerous at the end.
So this actually is a good time to bring back something that Nico said earlier that I meant to bring up, but chat got away from me. Which Nico said, I never liked the who would win in a fight question. If you have a definitive answer to this, the fight you are staging is pointless. Yes. I much prefer how could X win against Y, and I feel like that is so much of power levels in like tabletop gaming, right? So much of that is not because in that case, hopefully the answer isn't definitive as to who could win the fight. Hopefully the answer isn't definitive, because otherwise, why are you doing it? It's if the outcome is assured, then it's kind of, I mean, you have a good idea. It's weighted in favor of the players, kind of theoretically, depending on the type of game you're playing. But not necessarily. And so, but so hopefully the outcome is unknown, which means, at least to the players, hopefully the outcome is unknown, which means that most of their energy during that whole thing is spent figuring out how do we beat the monster, right? How do we, like, we have this power, monsters have their powers. How do we leverage what we have to win? And I think that's an interesting conversation too, right? That's more the conversation that you tend to have when it comes to power levels in tabletop gaming, is the question of how do we use it?
Right. And this is something, especially as somebody who's been a player a lot and somebody who's been GM a lot, there's a lot of times when like the GM plunks something like, oh, a sphinx, or like, oh, an ancient dragon, or oh, a beholder, or a room full of beholders, as recently happened.
I mean, what are you going to do? Level a whole party of level 18s and 19s. What are you going to do?
Yeah, exactly. Um, and so there's certainly this moment of like, oh shit, what am I going to do? And there's lots of moments, I think, especially as a GM, where I put something in front of my players and I'm like, oh, they're shredding this. Um, but there is a lot of satisfaction in being thrown into an encounter and having to figure out like all of these moving parts, all the elements of it. Um, and then kind of work out how to leverage the power that you have versus the environment and the enemies to find your path to success.
Ouch, geek outs. Arch Lich level 30 and 10 zombie beholders. Yeah, I mean, that'd do it, I guess.
Whoa. That's crazy.
That'd do it. Yeah, which sorry, just taking an aside. In Critical Role Campaign 1, like, spoilers to anybody who's making their way through that, but when they fight Vecna, why are there no zombie beholders? That's my question. Probably because it would have been a bitch and a half for Matt to run those too, so, along with everything else that was going on. But
That was
Yeah,
quite
that was-
yeah.
anyway,
There was a lot
What-
going on.
Actually, there might be an interesting discussion to have about power there in the moment in that fight.
Oh.
The,
But that might be too. I don't know.
too spoilery?
maybe.
Or-
I mean, I'm fairly certain that everybody who is currently in our chat has either seen it or has no interest in seeing it, or just straight up doesn't know what we're talking about. But that said, I'm not sure. I'm a little wary of
Fair.
that one, but
Fair. Oh God, I had something else to say, and I've totally blanked.
was
on,
it prior
on-
to the zombie beholders
It
thing?
was prior
Okay.
to the zombie beholders.
You were talking about the
Zombie beholders have a tendency of making
They're a little
one
distracting,
forget their
yeah.
thoughts. Yeah.
Oh, I was just knowledge. Right. That's actually, and Nico just posted something interesting in chat, which is that I think in RPGs, knowledge is a huge part of
Yeah.
the party's power. To that end, it's interesting. I think maybe that might be what it was. I wrote it down and then failed to look at the notes in front of me, but I wrote down on my little note card GM versus player power levels. Because
yes.
in many ways at the RPG table, there's a huge power disparity between
Taking this
the
meta.
game master. At least in Dungeons and Dragons, there's a huge power disparity, I think, between the game master and the players.
Yeah, that's definitely a big thing, which is one of the reasons. I'm sorry, I paused because I'm trying to determine whether my brain did the ADHD thing where I just like very quickly associated things and am not actually bridging a connection that is logical and easy to follow. I think I didn't do that. Okay, so it's one of the reasons why I love games that give much more narrative power back to the players.
Hmm.
It's one of the reasons why I love that, or any game mechanics that do that, because it is. It's like, okay, look at writers' room for example, right? We have our writers. It started out with just you and I, John,
Hmm.
and then at some point we're like, you know what? We need another voice in here because our thoughts are way too similar most of the time, and we draw from a lot of the same media. So then we brought in Caitlin, and now all the three of us have sort of melded into sort of a middle place where our thoughts are similar, but we've just incorporated what Caitlin's thought process into ours.
Hmm.
But it's one. But then you look at our Patreon writers room stuff, right? They're world builders, and then the extra flavors and extra ideas that they bring to the table that we wouldn't have thought of because they're not us. They don't necessarily draw from the same media that we do. They don't have the same background that we do, so they bring new things. The same is true at of narrative control at a tabletop RPG table, right? At your RPG table. The same is true. The more voices you have actively contributing to the story, the better it's going to be. The more
and
fulfilling it's going to be.
and specifically so, I think the more unique voices that you have, like contributing to that conversation, because like, oh yeah, like there's the variety of experience there, and this is something that's true of teaching too. And like in the classroom, a lot of times the way that I as a teacher wind up delivering something differently is because a student brought some new experience that I hadn't considered to the classroom, and then in their bringing that to light, I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. And in the same way that it happens the same way at the table as a GM too. There's a lot of times that things, especially in games that I run there's a lot of times that things happen because a player said something really cool that I just had not considered at all, and I'm like, oh, we're running with that. That wasn't the solution that I had in mind, but I'm gonna go wild with that idea because it's really
Yeah.
neat.
There's I can't say what because it hasn't come up yet, but there John, you'll probably know what I'm talking about, but there has absolutely been a moment like that in Infinite Horizon where a player said like misunderstood what I was telling them, the information I was presenting to them, and then they said what they interpreted my words to mean, and I sat there going, "Oh, that's better. That makes way more sense, and I like that a lot more. Where can I go with that?" And so that's already happened in Infinite Horizon, which we will see the fruits of which we will see soon. But
That's cool.
yeah,
Huh.
um,
I think this brings me around to talking about the cipher system in terms
mhm.
of like player versus GM dynamics. And I haven't GM'd the cipher system, but I have played a fair bit of cipher system at this point. And first of all, MCG, props for like creating this beautiful system that is so like comprehensive and elegant.
Yeah,
it's
Mhm.
a it's
Absolutely.
it's insane to me, and the thing that's insane to me about it is I as the player feel like I have just as much control over what's happening in the story in a very satisfying
mhm,
way as the GM does, between like game mechanics like XP expenditures
Hmm.
and intellect like insights to be able to like shape the course of what's going on, whether it's deciding that there's a computer terminal in the next room that has a post-it note stuck to it with all the passwords on it so that I can get us out easier, or whether it's inventing an NPC, or whether it's a player intrusion where I'm just like, I know that you said this was happening, but consider, what about this, right?
but what if
Hmm.
this? Yeah,
What if that
exactly.
happened?
And I think that's good. I do I'm distracted because I do want to kind of pivot back to something Nico said earlier because we kind of moved away from what he was saying, but um but that is the question that has me thinking, right? Because ultimately, even the cipher system will concede that it's the GM's call whether to allow it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could say in that case that like there's definitive proof that even in cipher the GM has more power than the players. But I think this brings us back to that would bring us back to the conversation about types of power, right? Like there's different types of power involved in the dynamics at the table. Um, And in Cypher, it just what Cypher does is it spreads it around a little bit more, right? Where it's no longer the GM's solely the GM's responsibility or to generate ideas, right? I mean, it usually isn't as well, but to an even lesser degree in Cypher because the system itself empowers players to be generators of ideas, right?
Yeah.
Through mechanics. And I think uh that's the thing there. It's not so much that it the system changes who has the power. It just sort of redistributes it a little bit.
Mhm.
But I want to go back to what Nico was saying before, which was
Grab something.
about the idea of knowledge being a huge part of a party's power. A fight against a beholder, for example, is way more difficult when you have no idea what a beholder does. Yes, exactly. That's huge. Knowledge absolutely is a huge part of the power,
Mhm.
which is really an interesting thing, both in terms of the dynamics of the game itself, like in world, but also on a meta level is pretty interesting because on a meta level, it's sort of in a way thematic that knowledge is power. It reinforces
Mhm.
that, which is kind of interesting,
Mhm.
right? Not just on the part of the player characters, but also on the part of the players. I don't know.
Yeah.
That like multi-level reinforcement of that ideal is kind of interesting.
It's it's always interesting when you play a character who might not know anything about this, but you do
Right,
as a
see that's a whole
you.
different thing too.
Mhm.
Yeah. Sorry, keep going. I didn't
Yeah.
mean to interrupt.
No, no, I thought that's kind of what you were talking about. So I just brought up a different thing, and I find out now. But yeah, no, I like the kind of your character might not know, but you do.
Mhm.
So you you have a choice to, um, I guess, play your character like they don't know,
Mhm.
or you could somehow try to get the information or know things about it that you know somehow your character person your character knows. I don't really know where this thought's going anymore.
Yeah, no, no. I think I
uh,
that makes sense to
but
me though. That that it matters. It matters. The idea of knowledge being power matters, especially when there is a there's like a disconnect between what you the player knows and what
yeah,
the character knows. Like
exactly.
that question matters so much there because
Hmm.
it's a question of, and that's a question that I as the GM in a lot of cases have to make that call, right? So, and that's often what goes into my determining whether I'm going to call for a knowledge roll or something like that, right?
Hmm.
Because I'm like, how much will the player character's knowledge of this affect the outcome, right? And then I weighing that against, sometimes it's against balance, sometimes it's against drama. It depends on the type of game again that we're playing. But yeah, it's an important question to wrangle with in some capacity.
It almost harkens back to that comment that Nico made about like how would character win? Like it's
Mhm.
there's this differential or this disparity in knowledge, power, whatever you want to call it, between you and the character that you are playing, and so you have to think to yourself how do I go about doing this thing? Because I, the player, know this, but there's no way that my character would know this thing in this moment.
Mhm. Right.
So,
Yeah. And it gets harder the longer, like with D&D it gets harder the longer you play, because you have to you have to there's a weird line to be walked between, like when it comes to knowing what a creature can do, a creature that you're fighting can do. There's a weird line to be walked of like, okay, do I do what my character would do, and knowing what they know, and intentionally doing something, like how far do you take it, right?
mhm.
Do you take it to the level where you do something that you know isn't going to work just because your character in that moment wouldn't know, or right, and then there's that's and or do you err on the game side of it where you, the player, knows that this creature is immune to this type of damage, so you do something else, right? Like, and there's a weird line to be walked there, which is why I generally try to, as the GM, avoid that question altogether, and make it essentially
Mhm.
not matter, and either just allow a free roll for the knowledge and let chance decide, or just say, yeah, your character probably knows about as much as you do, right? Because at a certain point, if you've been playing long enough, I don't know, you start to impede your own. It can get to a point where you could be impeding your own enjoyment of the game
Yeah.
just for the sake of not metagaming. But yeah, I don't know.
That's why I love playing a barbarian. Or I did.
The question's always
I take
answered for you because you never know anything about anything.
Yeah, I was gonna take. I take that back a little bit actually, because when I first started playing, when we first started playing Pathfinder,
Mm-hmm.
I played the barbarian because I and what do you know? The intelligence was so low that it didn't that kind of thing was just like, I don't have to know this stuff. I just need to be good with a sword. And at the time when I first made this character, I did that sort of purposefully because I wanted to get into the game and kind of just focus on the strength of what a barbarian would do. So they're, they come from a tribe maybe, or the woods, or as mine did. My barbarian comes from the woods or the mountains and draws his power from his strength. Um, and I didn't, as time went on, of course, and we played more, I kind of got more interested in the abilities of different characters. They just fascinated me watching other people play wizards or warlocks, for instance. I liked playing a warlock a few times. But when I first played D&D, when I first started playing, I wanted to play a much simpler character to understand everything, kind of how everything works.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a
Because a
thing.
barbarian didn't have to know anything. That's the point I was
Yeah,
trying to make. Is I didn't. He could, but he chose not. I chose not to know for him because it was at the time I didn't know what some of those things were even.
right, and that's kind of the point that I was making, which is that over
Yeah.
time, the longer you play, the more you start losing the ability to experience wonder at certain things because it's not it's not new anymore, right? Like like the first
And
time that you face down against a beholder, not knowing what it is or what it can do, it's like, oh no, oh shit, what's gonna happen? But then like some of that the immediacy of that danger sort of wears off when you're like, all right, which of its rays is it? If it's this one, then I think I'll be okay. But if it's this one, I'm screwed, right? Like if you're, I don't know. There's value in
Hmm.
that too. I think in that kind of play
Yeah.
as well. But I don't know. It's
for like to steer the this thought, I think, in the direction of power again, it's
Mhm.
I think it's why at higher levels, and especially in later D&D, you verge into the JRPG like style. We have slain the local zombies and then the dragon that was hoarding and terrorizing the realm, and now we must use the power of friendship to kill God, right? Because we've faced down beholders, and we know how to do that. And so like the problem at that point, I think, becomes one that like conflict at that point must be more existential in order to like sorry, I just saw that in chat. um like your threats as almost in the narrative sense have to almost become more existential because of
Mhm.
the relative power of the characters, and not just the characters but also the players, because the players, just by being familiar with the system, are almost more powerful. Like their characters wind up being just a little bit more powerful, or they as players wind up being having a little bit more power. The more that they know, the more comfortable they are with the things that they're experiencing.
Mhm.
Like again, like people who've played D&D for a few years, like you wind up fighting a few beholders in that time. And so like it does come down to, instead of like what is this thing and how do I fight it, it comes down to, like you said, that calculus of like, okay, well, which of its eye rays can I survive?
Yeah. Um. And that's yeah, exactly. And it's not even I should clarify that when I say the longer you play, the more uh, difficult it gets to attain that same level of wonder and um, maybe sense of danger, right? That when I say that, I don't necessarily just mean in a single campaign, right? The higher level the players get. I'm talking like even if you go back and play with the same players and you go back to level one, it's not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
It's not the same thing as the first time somebody plays and the first time they're experiencing certain creatures and certain things, right? Like it's not the same experience at all, right? Like I remember one of my favorite things running in our home game way back was the ability to um, was the confidence I had with which I could present the players with a new creature and they would have absolutely no idea anything about it and that like changed the dynamic of combat or even just interacting with the creature. Whereas now, one of my friends who is one of the players in that game, who has since taken to DMing himself and therefore has spent a bunch of time pouring through the monster manual, now like there's nothing that I can do. I can put something in front of him and I'll describe it in a certain way and he'll just know what it is and he's like, "Ah, okay, I know what this is." And even if his character doesn't, even if he perfectly plays that as not like his character not knowing, it's not the same thing. It's not the same
Yeah.
as just not knowing what something is and going, "Oh, this is cool," or "Holy
Hmm.
shit, what is that? Is it going to kill us?" Right? That kind of thing.
It's one of the things that's really fun to me actually right now about being really steeped in is several games that feature a lot of like superhero and comic book elements because that's not like media that I had really engaged with up until the last few years. And so I'm still kind of at that point when superhero stuff happens and like when people have superpowers that do certain things that I'm just like, what? You know, where a lot of people are like, oh yeah, like this character from this comic book, and I'm just like over here with fireworks shooting out of my head, like.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I want to go into this. I think this is interesting. Nico said, "For that matter, I feel like D&D does a poor job with its creature design in terms of gameplay mechanics." Yes, in a lot of ways. One of the things that and then this wouldn't solve the issue, but one of the things that I do miss about Pathfinder, um, is templates, creature templates, where
Hmm.
essentially like Lich was a template that you could apply to a variety of creatures, whichever ones you felt like you wanted to. You could apply that template to a creature. So you could, if you really wanted to, you could have like a bugbear lich or like a fucking sphinx
Oh.
lich, right? You could do that. The same thing like undead was a template, fey was a template, outsiders, right? The those who came from the outer planes, that was a template that you could apply to lots of different things. And so then like you can effectively do the same thing, just homebrewing stuff. But it's much easier when you have rules to go by that are like, just take this template, slap it onto that monster, replace a few things, move some shit around, and you've
Hmm.
got a brand new monster, right? One that they've never seen before. They don't know what this does. And there's something it's it goes back to that thing we were talking about earlier about how not having limitations doesn't necessarily limit outcome. Um, it's or like sorry, having limitations doesn't necessarily limit outcome, right? Because it gives you the templates give you like something to work with that gives you it's like a seed in a way. Here's an idea. Now, how are you going to take that idea and do something cool with it, as opposed to here is a blank canvas, do something with it, right? Like
Yeah.
very different things. Yeah.
I think like the thing that I was thinking about this too, and the thing that strikes me as as somebody who's like read swaths of the monster manual is there's these blocks of text above so many of the monsters in there that just have like this rich, interesting lore. But then so much of that translates to just some like sort of boring numerical advantages like oh yes it's an undead so it has immunity to poison and charms and that's like you know and like I'm not I'm not saying that that's a necessarily incorrect way, but I think like things like as Nico put it in chat, trolls, or like, to harken to my current home game, vampires, have mechanical strengths and weaknesses that feel flavorful and impactful, and like I would love to see more of that with other characters. Like a banshee, for instance, is a very specific type of undead, and it's got the ability, like with its wail, to reduce somebody to 0 hit points, because
Mhm.
that's like in the banshee's real life folklore, like kind of how a banshee, like a banshee's wail works. You hear the wail of a banshee and you
Mhm.
die. But I would love to see like more of that interesting like lore that they write out be executed on in the mechanics in ways that aren't just like
It makes their
numerical
numbers
power
bigger.
advantage.
Hmm.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's one of the like Tarask is an iconic like D&D joke encounter almost, but like it doesn't have a literal zillion hit points, but it's got a lot of mechanical things that make it
Mhm.
very much give it the feeling that it is this monstrous, nearly impossible creature to kill.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's important. Whoop. I just pulled the headphones out of my ear. Hold on a second. I
Oh,
can't
quick.
hear anything. Okay, there we
I
go.
was gonna say, quick, talk about Lucas while his headphones are out. Quick, everyone be nice to Lucas while his headphones aren't in.
Don't even do it. I will ban you. I'm just kidding. I won't do that. I have mod privileges. No.
Actually, one last interesting little game. I wheeled over to grab it a minute ago when we were
Mhm.
talking about power differentials between GMs and players. Um, and this is a game. If any of you are familiar with Matthew Graveland, the guy who made Mall Kids, he made this really cool Mint Tin game called Tapestry. And Matthew makes a lot of these GM-less games where they're like as much a storytelling like tool or prompt as they are like an actual game. And the way that Tapestry works is you have players sit down, each of them have equal agency in the storytelling. Like there's no one person who is the storyteller. You all have kind of equal power, and you are dealt a hand of cards that you play out physically on top of each other in different directions to advance the story.
Hmm.
And so I think it's a very like interesting way of providing each person with narrative control. And at the end of each round of play, you take another little tile that fits in your mint tin and you place it on the end of one of the branches of the story that you have made with your cards to kind of bring that to a close. So like um it's it's a cool game in that
Hmm.
like there's enough structure and random like randomness in like what cards you draw to play and to make your character that you're using to influence the outcome of the story, um, that you feel like you have a pretty um, rather there are enough limitations such that you feel like you have a structure with which to engage with the story, but you don't feel a lack of um, or like you don't have the problem where you have too much freedom in that you might suspect in a game without a GM or without a
Right.
storyteller.
Well, and it's interesting because even in, uh, I was thinking recently when thinking about GM-less games, I was thinking about how like I don't think I've actually ever played one, and that's technically true. But there have been sequences of games that were basically GM-less for a while, like the best example of which being that recent time in your game, John, the game that you're running, where it was just sort of like after all of the big epic fighting and story stuff had come to a conclusion, then there was just sort of like a party where everybody sort of got to blow off steam and relax, and that whole sequence was just us taking it in turns but not in any specific order to just like narrate what was happening with our character at various non-linear points throughout the night.
Mhm.
um and
And
yeah.
I spent and I say scene, it was like 2 hours that we spent in game doing this. I spent most of that just like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And it was just like a bunch of yeah, it was kind of cool the way that it played out, where it was sort of a weird call and response situation happening, right? Where it's like the player's saying like at some point during the night this happens and I do this and my character does this and this happens, and then it was sort of like us taking the ball and throwing it to John so that then John would tell us what happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
Other things like explain the things that are outside of our character's immediate control, things that were happening, how that snippet played out. Um, and then he would take it, respond, and basically throw it back. And we basically just did this like a giant game of narrative catch, you know,
Mm-hmm.
like
And like in that moment, we all had about the same amount of power at the table. Like I really, in the grand scheme of things, there was no narrative that I was pushing or driving there. There was no like monster that you guys had to kill before the end of the night. Like you'd already done all of that, and so it was very much just kind of uh, a moment in which we as players at the table all kind of were just, you know, uh, commiserating almost, or just like a 2 hour long act of freeform role play where we kind of just pass the power back and forth. Where a lot of times with the GM to player thing, it's almost like an ask and tell.
Hmm.
May I do this thing? Yes, you may do this thing.
mm-hmm,
This is what
right.
happens.
It was much more like I this is a thing that I do, and then the implied question of how does it play out, and then John answering that question and throwing it back, be like what comes, and then the implied question of what comes next, you know,
Mm-hmm.
which honestly is how I would prefer most of my games to go, most of the games that I run to go, um, is rather than like players saying, "Oh, can I do this? Is this a thing that I can do?" Just telling me what they do, and then you know, and then I just gotta work with it. I gotta work with it. I gotta figure out how to make it work. I gotta, you know, yeah.
It's a it's an interesting line, I think, to ride as a game developer between like when you're making new tabletop RPGs and narrative driven games. It's an interesting line to ride between too much and too little structure.
hmm Yeah, and I think this kind of bringing us back around to the because this is essentially what we were talking about, just in a different way, bringing us back to the conversation about power, right? What we're talking about here is a it's still a conversation about power, but it's a conversation now where we're talking about a situation where power is shared almost equally at the table, right? Or as close to equally as it can be in a game like Cypher or D&D without totally losing structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's an element of it. Um,
Hmm.
The the thought that I just had, which is one that applies in a broader social sense too, with uh, is that when there's an equitable amount of power distributed at the TT, like at the RPG table, people tend to have a lot of fun.
mm-hmm.
And in the broader sense, when there is an equitable amount of power distributed through a society, things seem to work pretty well.
Yeah. Or at the very least, they don't devour themselves from the inside.
Hmm.
Yes.
um, anyway, but yeah, no, I think that's important, and that's how I think that's the growing issue that I've had with rules heavy games like D&D is that just by nature of their design, and by which I mean the volume of rules, um, and yes, I did mean that on every level, the volume of rules.
Yeah, I'm searching for
um,
my where I've set my player's handbook.
uh, just by nature of that, the way that it is designed, it forces the GM or it forces the DM to be in the position of rules arbiter, right? Of the one who, not the facilitator for narrative gameplay, the rules arbiter, the one who says, yes, these are the rules, these are not the rules. This is within the rules, this is against the rules. and basically it forces you to do that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the problem with that is it weights the game far more heavily in the direction of it's so much easier to go in the direction of having an antagonistic relationship with between GM and players, because the GM's job is essentially saying these are the rules. No, you can't do that because that's not the rules. And how, game basically, and and it's not necessarily only about the rules, because you look at a system like Star Trek Adventures, which is a very crunchy system. There's lots of rules in that book. There are lots of rules in that game, but even still, that game still, in with all the rules, makes it so important. It emphasizes the fact that everybody has to have some level of narrative power. It explicitly says, "Hey, guess what? Uh, your players, the player characters, if they've been through Starfleet Academy, they're competent, so they know what they're talking about. That doesn't mean they're going to succeed all the time. It just means that their ideas, probably good ones. So, and it like emphasizes that. So even with that, it's really more, I think, a matter of where the rules are in the system. I don't know. This is not me making a point. This is me just word vomiting random thoughts that are coming to my brain as I'm saying them. So
Like this much of the player's handbook is devoted to telling you what your character is, and this much of the player's handbook is devoted to telling you what your character is allowed to do. Um,
Yep.
And I'm including like all of the combat mechanics and all of spellcasting in there, because spellcasting is like a third of this book. But it's interesting in that, and I know the cipher rulebook is thicker than that, but that's because the cipher rulebook is a DMG, a monster manual, an artifact list, and
It's all of it.
Not only that, but
and
it's also like there's like 7 pages basically in the cipher rulebook that tell you how to play the game.
yeah, like the amount
tell you
of,
the rules.
Of time, the amount of time that the cipher rulebook spends telling you the rules of the game is very brief, and the rest of it is all just like zillions of ideas about how to maybe run your game or how to establish your character story, or just like lists upon lists of ways to create interesting varied characters and worlds. So,
Also, oh yeah, this is the cipher system rulebook also says that the thoughts behind insights is that player characters are competent. Yep, exactly, geekets. And what was I going to say? I was going to say something relevant to what you were saying just now, John, which was that I think it was about the cipher system.
I do appreciate that about the cipher system. There's a deterministic way for me to gain an insight. Whereas with, and I understand that like in the heat of battle, it's excusable for a character to not remember something, but it does feel very good in Cipher to be able to like push the hint button.
Yeah.
There's also, um, gosh, the fact that additionally, the cipher system rules. I was actually reading an interesting conversation today on Twitter about how D&D is basically everything that a character is and can do. There's a rigid framework of rules, and then everything that a character can do and is are just exceptions to that rigid framework. Right? Like in your character at this level, you gain the ability to, when you normally would do this, you instead do this, or when most other characters would have to just suffer through this, you can do this instead, and you don't have to do right. It's just exceptions. Whereas the cipher system, it's like, all right, here just enough rules for you to have some sort of structure into like how to make things happen in the game, and then they actually have a system like in the rules that essentially is like, here's the rules, break them, right? It's like, it's essentially saying this is how this works, but if you don't want it to work like that, you don't have to have it work like that. You can have it work however you want.
I do love that about your best game ever and the cipher system rules, is that so many times when I look up the page where things are, I feel like I am sitting at the dev table with Monty Cook, and I'm like, hey Monty Cook, how
Yeah.
does this thing work? And Monty Cook
Right.
is like, well, this is how we envisioned it working, but like, do whatever you want, man.
Yeah, because like but they don't just and this is where I appreciate it. This is the difference between what because you could say that yeah, like the D&D devs they say the same thing, except the difference between what they say is in D&D is like if a rule doesn't work for you, if it's not, then just fucking Marie Kondo that shit, right? That's
Right.
that's not what Cypher says. Cypher says sometimes it is important narratively in the story for a character to be able to do something that the rules don't explicitly say that they can do. And so it's important for them to have the option to make something like that happen because it's cool, it's fun, it feels good, it's entertaining, and that is where they're like additional spending. Hey, guess what? Your ability would normally cost this much from your pool. Well, spend a little bit more and see if you can have it work a different way, right? And I think that's huge. That is a big deal because it's essentially it is literally a rule. Like the Cypher system says, do whatever you want. Run the game the way that you want it to go. And for those of you who are not comfortable doing that yourselves, here's us giving you permission to break.
We are giving you explicit permission
This is
to break the rules.
a actual mechanic that's not an optional mechanic. It is just a mechanic that allows you to ignore the other mechanics. So yeah, I think that's kind of cool.
Matt making another compelling rule about one of the few rules in the Cypher systems, which is don't be a wang rod.
Yes.
To borrow a phrase from Matt Colville.
Exactly. That's a good rule for life, honestly.
Yes, it really
Don't be a wang
really
rod.
is. Especially after a lot of the conversation this past week on social media about the behavior of a lot of authors in the science fiction and fantasy thing. It's just like, don't be a wang rod, please.
And also just within the streaming sphere as well, and
Yeah.
creating in general. Anyway, we have moved past our time. We've
We
just
have rambled
shot right
right-
by it.
Classic.
Freeman,
We've rambled our way past it.
Freeman,
up?
do you have any parting thoughts before we wrap up?
On the power
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Don't use your power to be a wang rod.
There we go. There we go.
Wait, no, he's up here.
Please
Yeah.
and thank you.
Jolly old Obnixilus says, "Within all spheres, do not be a wang rod." Exactly. Within all
Awesome.
spheres. God, I need to have that on a shirt
I need that
or a
shirt
plaque.
exactly. Ooh, even better.
Huh.
Sorry, I was trying to remember what the
Button
the
or
phrase.
a pin. I'm sorry.
A patch.
Just-
I love patches. I need some new ones.
Oh yes. I was just trying to remember where the phrase "conjunction of the spheres" came from, and it's a Witcher phrase, and I have no idea what
Oh.
it means. But I just saw "in all spheres" and then thought of that
Uh-huh.
phrase, and I'm like,
Yeah.
in all of the many universes in The Witcher, don't be a wang rod,
Yeah.
and also in the many spheres of real life.
That's right.
Exactly. Nico's calling us out. Ramblemancy going overtime? I'm shooketh.
I'm shook.
Ridiculous. This is the first time we've ever gone overtime. The first time we've ever been late on anything because we are normally perfect and perfect arbiters of where the time. I can't even finish that sentence.
Oh.
All right. Well, we are going to go, but before we do, a word from our sponsors. Us. No.
I'm ready on the on the links.
So, if you enjoyed what you saw here tonight, you can catch more Ramblemancy every Friday right here at 7 p.m. Pacific time. And other things that I was going to say. Right. So, if you wish to support all of the hard work and beautiful individuals that you see, such as John, who frequently will vogue for the camera, there are a number of ways you can do that. First of all, you can go to Patreon. Patreon is a place where we have a bunch of different rewards. at various tiers, not including but not limited to our tabletop tool chest, where you have a bunch of ideas and seeds for various genres and various creative endeavors within those genres, um, as well as our world builders tier, who get a chance to once a month get in a writer's room meeting with myself and John. John, who's down here in my screen. And we get to just create stuff for our existing tabletop RPG shows. We're actually going to be getting together next week to do just that. I'm very excited. We have
Tuesday, right?
Yes,
Yeah, I'm
we
pumped for
have
that.
a coffee where you can sort of a low commitment sort of way of supporting us, sort of one-time donation type thing. So if that's all you can commit to is right now, that's a way to do it. We have merch, where you can get shirts very much like the one Freeman is wearing right now, Infinite Horizon shirt, as well as various other Roll logo merch, including Henry's favorite mug.
It's a good mug.
It's just a good mug.
This is one of the ways in which I cannot, one of the many ways in which I cannot
Lost
replace
my
Henry.
headset.
I
I know.
cannot hold up the mug.
I know you can't hold up the mug, but
It's true. Does this count?
does what count? Sure. Well, that's not what it looks like. Not an actual
It's not,
depiction,
not,
but
not at all.
close enough. Karaoke Night 69 says it's a good mug. It is, and they would know because they have one. At least one.
Awesome.
I don't remember how many you have. Anyway, in addition to that, when it comes to subscribing on Twitch, which you can do because we are affiliates here, you also get some of the content from Patreon, the first and second tier content, I believe, if you connect your Twitch to your Discord. If you do that, you will be automatically put into the appropriate channels. Finally, consuming our content may be difficult for you if you don't have an hour and a half to 3 hours to spare on Fridays and Wednesdays. But the good news is that you can check out past episodes of Infinite Horizon on YouTube, and the latest episode always comes out on YouTube the Friday immediately following the episode. So there's that. You can also listen to it on podcast. The link here is to the seed site, which is Anchor, but there's various other platforms where you can listen to the podcast of Infinite Horizon.
Apple Podcast, Breaker, Castbox, Google Podcast, Overcast.
Don't forget iTunes, finally.
Yes, right. To mention a few, Spotify as well. I forgot about I completely forgot about Spotify. My bad, but
they're all
it
in
is
there.
there.
Like, and if your favorite isn't there, you can always use the RSS feed to just stick it right over there. One of our friends actually did that, and he's been listening to it on his favorite Pocket. No, not Pocket Cast. That's the one we have. I don't remember which one he likes, but he did it. He got it there, so you can do that. Did I miss anything?
If you want to catch up with any of us outside of stream hours, or if you have questions, comments, or just like memes or art or something to share, we've got a Discord where not only are our beautiful community members active, but so are our staff. You can catch us on during offline hours, poking around in any of our many chat channels.
It's also it's also a great place to go and at Henry and tell him that you love him very much for absolutely no reason. So if you feel like doing that, I would recommend doing that on our Discord. Let's see.
Me while I go do that right now.
It's happening live.
Listen, I'm not telling you to go to our Discord and at Henry to tell him how much you love him. I'm not telling you to do that. I'm simply stating that if you wished to do that, you could, and nobody would be upset about it. So, that's all I'm saying. So, yeah, I think that's everything. So before we go, I'm going to actually remember this time that I think Friends Who Roll Dice are still streaming.
Ooh,
I
Is
believe.
it time to raid?
Oh, hold on.
time to
That's not gonna work.
raid.
Yes, I think they are still streaming. Let me look at that.
I see that Saving Throw Show is on right now.
Ooh,
Let me.
they might have gone
switch.
off. They might have gone off because they
It's
were
just
streaming
Friends
for a
Who
while.
Roll.
Did they? Yeah.
They were on before we were, so.
Mm-hmm. They were. So.
Yeah, they're offline right now.
They're off. Okay. Mm,
Saving Throw Show is on, and Vanna is on.
yeah. Tell you what, I actually see there's a streamer that I've followed for a while. The Jam Plan. She is streaming right now. Streaming Animal Crossing actually.
The jam plan.
Yeah. So,
That's cool.
why don't we go and raid Jam? Wait. Geekut says wait. Geekut says wait. Freeman.
Oh, yes. No, wait.
Uh-huh. You can't play the guitar.
You're right. You know,
Oh gosh.
I can't. You're right. That's not very fair. What? I'm so sorry.
All right, y'all. We're gonna go raid Jam. So go. We're gonna jump on over there. Make sure to give Jam and her chat all of the Rule of Lore love. So we will see you. We aren't gonna be streaming this Saturday. We may be streaming next Saturday. We'll TBD, TBA. So we're gonna go do that. We're gonna have Infinite Horizon on Wednesday. So we'll see you then, or we'll see you the next time you decide to come roll with us. Here we go, everybody. We're getting that raid going.
I'm
All right.
gonna just vogue and wave.
I'm just gonna vogue and wave until we go. All right, everybody. All right, here we go. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much. Good night and good zone. Thank you for being here. I love all of you. Let's go give Jam our love.